Hello, my name is Jason Sanger, and this is my presentation for my final paper for the Architectural Theory 2 course. I have titled my paper Architectural Ego, Rethinking What It Means to Provide for Community and Ecology. So let's go ahead and get into it. So, problem statement. The problem that I have noticed is the ego of architects has taken hold and overrun architecture as we know it. And this can be seen in projects historically where architects have tried to employ personal transportation, such as cars. We can see this in the top right-hand corner. This is a Le Corbusier project in which he designed every building to be the same and the roads to be as big as some might call reasonably possible. And then here in the top left, we have an example of what I would call a cookie cutter apartment building. I personally am really not a fan of these types of designs. If you are, I apologize, but I will be diving into this a bit more. These designs are really product designs rather than architectural designs. They're intended to meet criteria of a company, criteria of a client, rather than the criteria of the users who in the end will actually be living in these buildings. They're built quickly, they're built cheaply, they're built for profit and not for people. So moving on to dig into the traditional model a little more of this cookie cutter design style that I've mentioned previously. On the top left and the bottom right, we can see images of historical Levitt towns. And for those of you who don't know, these were the original suburbs in post-World War II America, the original one being in Pennsylvania. And I like to point out the sort of sprawl that is occurring here and the complete reliance on car transportation. Now, we can point out the same with the strip malls on the top right and bottom left. You simply must have a car to get to these places. They're also devoid of really any sort of architectural interest. We can see the top right, they tried a little bit. Bottom left, they really sort of put a storefront on it. And this is the type of thing that is really a cash grab. It's for the money. This relates less to the issue of architectural ego and perhaps more to the issue of efficient and scalable architecture that has simply become monotonous due to the lack of higher design. Now, moving on a little bit more, I like to speak about Frank Lloyd Wright. So I've been reading a book only about Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm about halfway through it at the moment. And something that struck me as being very interesting about him as an architect is that nearly every single one of his designs, he has worked directly with the end users of the buildings. Frank Lloyd Wright worked primarily in the early 1900s to the mid 1900s. And as we can see on the bottom left, this image of falling water is a building, it's a home that's very beautiful and sort of pushed the boundaries um, at the time of what was possible and what was allowed in architecture. And while not only doing that, he catered to the end users of this home. Now, with that said, it of course was coming from an upper class family who was able to fund it. Frank Lloyd Wright himself was never really a rich man and he'd struggled with finances very strenuously. However, I think it's a decent example of how architecture can do what I believe it should do. However, this is still rooted in the egotistical nature of providing an expensive home for an expensive family. Now, on the top right, we can see Francis Kere, an African architect from Burkina Faso, who went to architecture school in Germany in order to better serve his local community. And He's creating individual designs for end users with end users, in my opinion, with a lack of ego. He won the Pritzker Prize, and while he was happy to receive it, he had never planned on receiving it. And that struck me as the type of architect that I aspire to be someday because of that lack of ego. Now, moving on to the first of two success stories I like to talk about is Michael Reynolds' Earthships. Now, these were designed and built alongside the inhabitants who would be living there in the Australian desert, which gets, I believe, less than 7 inches of rain per year. Has no plumbing hookups. The city has no electricity hookups either, and no heating or cooling, other than passive heating and passive cooling. So the designs of these buildings are so ecologically significant that they are self-sustaining. And in terms of water, all water is collected when it does rain in the desert and is used and reused and recycled. Not to mention that the buildings are made out of entirely earth and trash. And I think this is incredible and is something that we could use really to better benefit communities and the environment. It's also a way to get away from ego as architects. Now, moving on to the second success story, I studied this for my studio project this semester because my site is in Bangladesh, and it's an incredible amphibious building because as we can see in the bottom left and top right images, there are periods of time where the deltaic land becomes dry and the building would need to rest on the ground. And then in the top left, we can see an example of when there is a flood, the building would need to float. And this is able to do both of those things. So architect Saif ul Haq's Arcadia School was designed with the community and the students who would be using the school so that they can get to and from it in floods when typically they would be displaced and would not be able to achieve education. So the first example of challenges faced when trying to get away from ego and benefit community and ecology is Rico Kirindongo and his project for Midtown Square in Seattle, Washington. He was hired by a firm who was receiving massive pushback from the local community. And I think this is significant because it shows not only his previous ability to do so, but as well as his care for communities and his ability to fight directly against gentrification and to allow the original inhabitants of this neighborhood to use the new designs and the new architecture that would be there. So, second example of a challenge is Anna Herringer's experience in designing the Mehti Handmade School in Bangladesh. So, her ideal before visiting there was that Bangladesh was a third world country and therefore was less than. And after visiting, she realized the beauty of the culture and the possibilities for architecture there. And she had publicly apologized in her TED Talk for her beliefs of third world countries. And that really struck me as getting away from ego and using that lack of ego to then support community and ecology. So now here my own case studies. Top left is my undergrad Studio 2 project, the Museum for Americas, which was intended to display works of Native American art of any Native Americans. And while I think that this would serve the community, it's a bit too broad scale. It's meant for the entirety of North America and South America, and it was intended to be in Denver. And so I think one museum wouldn't have been enough. It also had no ecology use. It was in a floodplain and did not address use of water or rain collection at all. My other project is the Phoenix Forum. We can see in these other images, and I believe that I did a much better job as this was pushed harder for the studio for ecology and sustainability reasons. I use weeping walls, keep it cool, pools as well for evaporative cooling, plants and such things, as well as passive heating and passive cooling. So my analysis of everything is that sustainability, ecology, and community are incredibly important, and the direction that we're moving towards these things is good. And I think that while we can look back to older precedents that are more rooted in wealth, that we can now see newer, much better examples of how to, again, serve communities and the environment. Thank you.